lecture covering music in the Baroque era, 1600-1750. So we just left off with opera, the invention of opera, developments of opera, characteristics of opera. So now we're going to talk about some very specific composers. We're going to start with Claudio Monteverdi because he is the earliest great opera composer. But that's not all he did. So first thing that's important about Monteverdi is he was the music director at the Cathedral of San Marco, or St. Mark's, in Venice, Italy. Venice was a very important city. It was the largest and wealthiest city, well, certainly the wealthiest city in Italy. It actually functioned as its own city-state that had its own person in charge of it called the Doge. So San Marco was this incredibly elaborate cathedral with all of these balconies all around it, which kind of led to a whole new form of music, because Monteverdi and some of his predecessors would write music for groups of musicians, some of them in this balcony, some of this in this balcony. So it was literally surround sound, only done live and in person. This is where he wrote a lot of sacred music. Monteverdi is well loved for all of his sacred music, his masses, his motets, and his instrumental music. But he also wrote secular music, including 12 operas. Of the 12 operas that he wrote, we only have 3 of them today. Only 3 of these operas, the music has survived to today, although we know he wrote 12 because of records. You know, people write letters, there are journals, there are even things like account ledgers saying who got paid for what. And so this is how we know that he wrote 12 operas, although we only have music for 3 of them. All his music is vocal, although it all has the basso continuo, the keyboard instrument and bass instrument to support, harmonically support this. And he wrote very emotional music. He was one of the first composers to use chromatic notes. That is to say, he used notes that were out of the regular scale to heighten the emotion. This is something that a lot of composers, or a few composers in this time, were doing. And we call them chromatic notes. These chromatic notes, by raising or lowering a note to create a dissonance, can really make the music powerful emotionally. So we're going to listen to a couple of things. The big example in the book is Tu sei morta, which means you are dead. It is an aria from his opera Orfeo. Now this is an opera based in a Greek tragedy of Orpheus and Eurydice. Basically, Orpheus is the world's greatest musician. He's the son of Apollo, and Apollo is the Greek god of music, among other things. And he just gets married to Eurydice, and then Eurydice gets bit by a snake, and she dies. And Orpheus is, of course, heartbroken at this, so he vows that he's going to go down into the underworld and sing for Hades, who is the god of the underworld, and so move him with his music that Hades will agree to do him a favor and let him bring Eurydice back. So Orpheus goes down to the underworld and he sings for Hades, and Hades is very moved and says, okay, you can go back up top and you can bring Eurydice with you, but you got to trust me. Go ahead and walk out of here and she will be right behind you. But if you lose faith, if you turn around and check to see if she's still there, then the deal's off and she will vanish back into the underworld. And that's what happened. Orpheus looks back over his shoulder, see if Eurydice is behind him, deal's off, she vanishes back into the underworld. But the other gods take pity on him and they raise Eurydice into the heavens as a star where Orpheus can gaze on her every night. It's a very popular tragedy. It's been staged many times. It's been set to music quite a few times. The example, Tu sei morta, or you are dead, is Orpheus singing his grief that Eurydice has just died, and then he resolves that he's going to go down into the underworld and bring her back. So there are going to be 2 video clips for you to watch that I'll link to. One is the opening of the opera, the overture, where this production I'm going to link to is really cool because it's a period production, meaning that it was just recorded not that long ago, but they tried to make it look and sound exactly like it would have looked and sounded in 1607 when this premiered. So the instruments that they're playing are either 400 years old or are copies of instruments that are 400 years old. What they're wearing is a choir robe, which looks exactly like a choir robe that Monteverdi is wearing in a very famous painting of him. This painting, as a matter of fact, they're all wearing choir robes that look exactly like what he's wearing in that painting. So it's a really cool production. So I'm going to first start with the overture, just so you can get a feel for the period. That's not very long at all, just a couple minutes. And then the next video link will be to the aria Tu sei morta by Monteverdi. So this is a good time to watch those now. Okay, so the next composer that we're going to talk about, this is chapter 10, is Antonio Vivaldi. Now some of you may have heard of Antonio Vivaldi, some of you may have not, but you've all heard his music. He wrote a set of violin concertos called the Four Seasons, which are among the most popular concerti ever written. And actually, if I were to play, as a matter of fact, I'll put a link to Spring from the Four Seasons. That's your listening assignment for Vivaldi. You'll all recognize it immediately. It's been used in many advertisements in movies and TV shows. You will all recognize it immediately. So Vivaldi lived in, he moved around Italy quite a bit, but he was a teacher, a conductor, and a composer, and a performer. He was a great violinist, and he worked at a place called La Pieta, which was an orphanage, an all-girls orphanage, where he put together an all-girls orchestra, which was one of the best orchestras in all of Italy. They were famous. They toured around Europe. They were so good. But the Catholic Church being what it was, women were not supposed to sing or perform in the Catholic Church. So what they actually did is they had this orchestra perform behind a screen so that no one could see them. The Catholic Church, being very forward-thinking, of course, didn't let women do anything of value in the church. Basically, for 200 years, Vivaldi's music was forgotten. He was very well known in his day, primarily for his violin concertos, but also for his operas and other things. But after his death, for almost 200 years, nobody played his music, or very few people played his music. Just a few scholars of the era were familiar with him. But in the 1950s, recording companies, because of the invention of the long-playing record, you could actually start recording a lot of classical music. And so they were looking for people to record, and they recorded some of Vivaldi's music. It became very popular. So starting in the 1950s, Vivaldi's music had a renaissance, and now he's probably the third most famous of all Baroque composers by today's standards, behind Bach and Handel. So we're going to listen to Spring from the Four Seasons. It's a concerto for violin and orchestra. It features the violin as the soloist. It's a really cool piece because it's the first example that I can think of, certainly the first well-known example, of something we'll talk about later units called program music, where it's instrumental music that attempts to sound like something. And usually they'll even write out what it's supposed to sound like. So the score, the music of this, actually has things written in it like, spring has come and the birds are chirping. And you hear the violin imitating the birds chirping. And then there's another section where you're kind of walking through the forest and you pass by a stream. And so the instruments kind of imitate water flowing by you in a stream. Then there's thunder and lightning, and you can hear the thunder. It's kind of this low rumble in the strings, and then the lightning is this very fast run in the violin. So it's a really cool piece. And I'm pretty confident that almost all of you have already heard it, even if you're not familiar with it. So this is a time to please listen to Spring from the Four Seasons by Antonio Vivaldi. Okay, so the final composer that we're going to talk about in any great detail, second to final composer, is Johann Sebastian Bach, the most famous of all Baroque composers, and generally considered to be one of the three most important composers of classical music who's ever lived. Bach, Mozart, and Beethoven are three of the four heads on the Mount Rushmore of music. Bach was born in 1685. He died in 1750. So, as I think I mentioned all the way back at the beginning of the first lecture from this part of the book, Bach, historians like nice round numbers to bracket eras, and the death of Bach in 1750 the greatest of all Baroque composers, nice round number. That's why people say that the Baroque era ended in 1750. He came from a family of musicians. His brother was a musician. His brother studied with a pretty famous Baroque composer named Pachelbel. Pachelbel's most famous composition is his canon in D minor. So Bach studied with his brother and other members of his family. He kind of moved on throughout different gigs. He worked for members of the nobility, he worked for churches, but for the last 30 or so years of his life, he lived in Leipzig, Germany, where he worked for the St. Thomas, the churches of St. Thomas, where he was in charge of music for a few different churches. So, he was Lutheran. We've been through the Protestant Reformation now, at this point. Talked about that in the Renaissance. And so, the Lutheran Church is now the big church in all of Germany, and Bach was a Lutheran composer. He played organ and wrote a lot of organ music. We talked about the fugue a few chapters ago, and we listened to Bach's fugue in G minor. He's considered to be the greatest composer of fugues who ever lived. But in his day, he was actually not thought of as being a great composer. He was successful, professional, you know. He was actually considered to be one of the great keyboard players, one of the great organists of his day. But as far as a composer, some people thought his music was too complicated, maybe a little too dense. There were other composers, like Telemann, for example. George Philippe Telemann was incredibly popular in his time, was far more famous in his day than Bach was. But after a period of time where Bach's music went unplayed, it was rediscovered in the 1800s, and from that point on, it's become among the most performed music in all of classical music history, and Bach's true genius has been recognized. And this leads us to the other thing. I mean, Bach was well known for a lot of things. He wrote music in all genres. He wrote concertos, both concerti grossi, or concerto grosso, like we listened to earlier in this unit, and fugues, of course, and lots of different kinds of organ music. The only thing he didn't write was opera. Bach never wrote an opera. But he's also well remembered for his cantatas. So, let's break down the chorale and the church cantata. In the Lutheran Church, unlike the Catholic Church, in the Catholic Church the congregation at that time did not sing. Either the choir sang or the priest sang, but the congregation didn't really get involved in singing. But it was different in the Protestant churches, where they valued congregational hymn singing. So, the Lutheran chorale, a bunch of these were written, adapted from various sources, or newly composed, and given words in German, and they were used, they were harmonized in four-part harmony. You'll recognize this, many of you, as just a very standard kind of church hymn. The way it's written, it's strophic, meaning that the music stays the same, even for each of the three verses. In the Lutheran Church, the congregation would sing these with organ accompaniment, but they would also use them as a departure point a lot of times for the cantata. A cantata was kind of a musical entertainment that happened in the middle of the church service. In the Lutheran Church during the Baroque era, services tended to last around 4 hours. So there was a lot of music in there, although the sermon by itself could last up to an hour frequently. But in addition to the congregation singing hymns, there was other music, and there was always a big chunk in the middle, about 20-25 minutes, that was dedicated to performance of a cantata. So, what is a cantata? It is written for chorus, soloist, vocal soloist, and orchestra with an organ. All of these, all of the Lutheran churches of any size had. They had a full-time choir, they had a small orchestra, they of course had an organist, and they would have vocal soloists that they would sing with the choir and be drawn out of the choir. A lot of times these cantatas incorporated these chorale melodies that I just talked about. It was always based on a religious text, a Christian text in German, because they all used their German translation of the Bible, which Martin Luther himself had done. And what would basically happen was, every week, Bach, or whoever the composer was, would go to the pastor at the beginning of the week and say, what is this week's sermon about? And they would say, okay, this week's sermon is going to be about greed. and Bach would say, got it, and he would go to his German Bible and he would look for appropriate passages to reinforce the message of the sermon, and then he would set those to music. It would last up to 25 minutes, and it was in multiple movements. You would have choruses, where the whole choir sang with the orchestra. You would have vocal solos, and recitatives, and occasional instrumental interlude. But structurally, it was kind of like opera in that you would have arias and recitatives and choruses. But of course, it was intended for church performance, and it was much, much shorter. There was no staging, there were no costumes. You would just perform it right at the front of the church with the congregation as your audience. Bach wrote 295 cantatas because he had to write different cantata for almost every week of the Lutheran church calendar, although as he went on in his career, he began to reuse earlier cantatas. I mean, honestly, there are only so many topics that a sermon could be on, and as we know, priests, pastors, whatever denomination you are, don't stay in one church for years and years. They'll tend to move on. A new person will come in, and then they'll give sermons, different sermons, but on the same topic. But that enabled Bach to reuse some of the cantatas that he had written when he was earlier. So now, we're going to listen to part of a Bach cantata. I will put the, I'll put it up on Blackboard so that you can listen to it. We're going to listen to the 7th movement, the final movement of his cantata number 140, which the last movement is actually just a straight out setting of the chorale. It doesn't have any of the complexity of any of his earlier music. I think just for fun, I'll also put a link to a different movement from a different cantata, one that shows a much more complex form of writing that he did. You can listen to that if you want. The one I'm going to link to is actually one of my all-time favorite pieces of music. It's an incredible, incredible piece of music. Okay, and that leads us to the oratorio. This is the last section that we're going to talk about. The oratorio was a large concert work. It had similarities to both opera and cantata. It also had differences. So, similarities. It was for chorus, vocal soloist, and orchestra, just like opera and just like cantata. Like opera, it was long. It lasted 2 to 3 hours. So it was a full concert by itself, long concert by itself, unlike the cantata, which was only around 20-25 minutes. Also, the oratorio had many different movements. The movements would be, again, recitatives, arias, choruses, orchestral interludes. So just like opera in that. Unlike opera, there's no acting, there's no scenery, there's no costumes. And also unlike opera, because Baroque opera was primarily based on Greek and Roman legends and mythologies, oratorio was based on biblical stories. And the text would be a narrative. Almost all of the famous cantatas tell a complete story from beginning to end, although the most famous, oratorios tell a complete story from beginning to end. But the most famous oratorio of all actually doesn't do that. We'll get to that in a moment. Although it's based on biblical stories, it was not intended for religious services. Instead, it was intended as a concert, and they would be performed in concert halls or in churches, but not as a service, as just a standalone concert. Most famous oratorio, Messiah, by George Friedrich Handel. Handel was German. He was born in the same area as Bach was, in the same year, just a month apart. Handel studied in Germany, and then he moved to Italy, and he studied Italian opera, and then eventually he settled in England, where he first wrote Italian operas, and then he shifted to this new format of English oratorios. All of Handel's oratorios were originally written in the English language. He originally had his own opera company when he moved to England, and was successful, but he went broke. He got into competition with another opera company, and they started outbidding each other for the most famous singers, and eventually both opera companies went under. There's a lesson there somewhere. Handel wrote a lot of oratorios, as well as other famous music. As I said, he has a lot of operas that he wrote that are famous, and he wrote instrumental music that is well known as well. But his oratorios are probably his best loved work. Handel's oratorios have never not been performed. Basically from the day he wrote them until yesterday, Handel's oratorios have been a constant, performed all over, originally all over Europe, then all over the world. His most famous is Messiah. That's different than his other oratorios. All of his other oratorios were based on the Old Testament and told a complete narrative, whereas Messiah is based on the New Testament and is not actually a complete story, it's just a series of little vignettes, if you will. It's 2.5 hours long. He cranked it out in 24 days. Its world premiere performance, if I remember correctly, was at a fundraiser for a debtor's prison. Back in the Baroque era, if you owed money, they would throw you in prison, which doesn't make any sense to me, because if you're in prison, you can't earn money to get out of debt. But, you know, this is not, you know, a discussion of comparative politics. It's in 3 parts. It has over 50 movements. Many of the movements are very short. Some of them are longer. And it is performed all over the world, sometimes by massive groups, sometimes by small groups. We perform it almost every year at Delaware State University. This is just a breakdown of the 50 movements, part 1, part 2, and part 3. It's usually divided into the Christmas portion and the Easter portion of it. And I'm now going to link to a recording of the most famous movement from his most famous oratorio, and it's something you've all heard a bunch because you hear it in TV shows and movies and video games probably, and commercials, and this is the Hallelujah Chorus. One really cool thing about the Hallelujah Chorus is he's always changing the texture. When he wants to say something very declamatory, he'll put in monophonic texture, where the chorus and the orchestra are just one line of music, nothing to distract you from the text. And then he'll break into polyphonic sections, where there's a lot of things happening, and then sometimes a homophonic section, so you can more clearly hear the words, but the music's a little busier. Handel was a master of all these different textures and it jumping back and forth. So when you listen to the Hallelujah Chorus, you can make a note of, oh, this is monophonic, this is polyphonic, and then make a note of what they're singing when they're going to the monophonic texture, because they're singing words that Handel considered to be the most important. Slide 60 is a breakdown of a comparison between opera, cantata, and oratorio, what they have in common, what they have not in common. All 3 genres that were developed in the Baroque era. Okay, that is the end of our Baroque lecture. So now you're going to have to take the exam. The exam covers the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and the Baroque periods, parts 2 and 3, and that will be available on Blackboard.